Equal Stages Off Script number 1. London Calling and Beyond. Una Marson, Her Life and Achievements. Delia Jarrett-Macauley talks to Ayesha Casely-Hayford about the Jamaican activist, poet and playwright.
Dee, I would really, really love to know why you chose Una Marson.
Well, it's funny you should ask that, because I always feel that she chose me rather than me choosing her. Or that is to say, I'd started doing quite a lot of research on Black women in Britain. I was interested to know more about women who were in Britain before Empire Windrush. So I was researching those who'd come in the 1920s or 30s. And I was very interested in women who lived in the port towns, Liverpool, Cardiff, London, and so on. One of the women I was researching was Islanda Robeson, who was married to Paul Robeson, and she was an anthropologist in her own right. And I'd heard of Una Marson, I'd come across her poetry. I knew that shortly after arriving in England, she had joined Harold Moody's League of Coloured Peoples. It was an organisation set up to look after race issues, if you like, in Britain and further afield. And so she was one of many that I was considering. And then I remember this very, very well, the day that I was sitting in the British Library, that's the old British Library, and I discovered in the news notes, which was the publication of the League of Coloured Peoples, a note that said, Una Marson, who is well known as a BBC producer, is now on holiday in Jamaica. And I thought that was absolutely remarkable because, of course, I mean, we're talking about the 1980s that I was doing this research, I got started on it. And in the 1980s, there weren't many Black women who were well known within the BBC as producers, directors, or indeed anything. You know, I was aware of Moira Stewart. I had a friend who was working on the production side, but they're a very, very small number. So that made me really curious about Una Marson, and I contacted the BBC Written Archive Centre, which is in Caversham, and they said, well, do come down, we have some papers on her. So I immediately went to Caversham. And what I discovered there was that indeed there was a personnel file, sort of letters regarding her employment, details about programs she had done, correspondence, internal correspondence. So that was great. But unfortunately, one of the major programs that she had initiated, which was called Caribbean Voices, had actually been scrubbed. So the recordings of all those early 1950s, earlier poets and short story writers, that had gone, but the scripts survived. Anyway, it was amazing to see, you know, to get a sense of the day-to-day reality of being a BBC employee for a Black woman at that time. And we're talking about, you know, the war years. So she was there from very, very early, actually, just before the war broke out, right through until 1945. So all the legislation that was in place, you know, to do with, you know, information, sharing secrets, handling of the empire, news that could go to the colonies, and all those things actually were reflected in the correspondence that I saw. So that was just super, super exciting. You know, it was great. I think for me, one of the big things at that time was that, you know, I was already conscious of the fantastic literature that we were getting from America, the African-American novelists and critics, you know, from the women who wrote, well, obviously there was Toni Morrison, there was Alice Walker, and then lots of critical writers. So Audre Lorde, and books that were very, very precious to me as a young Black woman who was, you know, I was a member of the Brixton Black Women's Group and so on. So, you know, something of an activist. But I was very, very concerned about the fact that we didn't have enough of our own stuff. That actually, if you think about the Black British population, you know, there's a dominant Jamaican population, there was certainly then, and obviously those of us whose parents come from Africa, particularly, West Africa. But we didn't have enough of our own stories being told. And I felt that it was really important that we do our own research and we rediscover, if you like, our own specific foremothers. So there was a time that came not long after that. I was putting together a collection of essays by, if you like, up and coming academics. I was sort of one myself, really. But in that book, I wrote about Una Marson and Zora Neale Hurston. I saw them as sort of twins, if you like. So Zora Neale Hurston had very much been the foremother of the great African-American writers, and she was obviously specifically not entirely rediscovered, but certainly brought to great prominence by Alice Walker. And then for the Caribbean, we had Una Marson, and Una Marson had influenced people like the women who set up Sister and Theatre Company in Jamaica, as well as young poets and short storytellers like Erna Brodber and so on. So I really saw that it was important to establish that although obviously the African Americans were our sisters, that actually we had our own route, if you like, to contemporary Black feminism or womanism in this country.
It's so lovely to hear about it, and the word discovery is the one that jumps out so much, because it sounds like it really was a case of what what and I can understand from yourself as a writer, activist, academic, and all that you are, author, and working in the BBC too, how it was just like, yeah, gosh, those footsteps had gone before. So I really understand what you are saying, and how fantastic that she could just arrive for you so you could then go forth and help us piece it all together and join it up. And from everything that you've gathered then, and seeing how many different things she did, like you mentioned the poetry as well there, what would you say is the biggest lesson that we can learn from her life?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, you're right. She was involved in many, many different things, and she made a number of different alliances as was appropriate. So she worked, as I said, with Harold Moody through the League of Colored People. She met people like Jomo Kenyatta. She worked with white British feminists and went with a group of them to Turkey and met Ataturk, and was obviously concerned about women's issues in more than just, say, the Caribbean or Britain. So there was a kind of international feminist thinking there. But I think if I step back a bit from all the bits, I think what strikes me the most is that she was absolutely her own person. She was, I think we have a tendency now to say, oh yes, this person was the first to do that and the first to do such and such, and that certainly has a, certain validity and helps us write and document history and achievements. But I think it's also really valuable to look at the ways in which a person carves out their own path. And that might not necessarily be something that is to do with sitting well with the establishment or gaining those firsts. It might be that, obviously when you're trying to do your own thing, some of your projects will fail. They may not actually come to fruition. But the important thing is to keep on your own path, I think. And she certainly did that. And she did it, there was a letter that she wrote, I remember, to James Weldon Johnson, the African-American sort of father of Harlem Renaissance, if you like. And she was saying in that letter to him that she wasn't kind of sure how to handle publishers, here, and asking for guidance and what have you. And I really like that sort of sense of the humility, but also underneath it, the determination that, this wasn't a woman who was a part of a a London-based Black writers group, or, you know, Sistren wasn't here, but she was willing to keep stretching herself to say, okay, I feel this should be my next step. I think we should absolutely not take for granted those accomplishments. It was a phenomenal thing, I think, in her time to not just publish collections of poetry in Jamaica, but also to, you know, make that bridge to come to London, to have her work on here in London, with, you know, members of the cast who were the young people that she met, you know, I think in the League of Coloured Peoples and others. But again, I think because there are now so many of us and we're, you know, doing our thing and we can connect and get information on each other quite quickly through Google and what have you, you know, think about somebody who has really come on her own and as many people do, intending to stay a few weeks and ending up here in London. And basically working out, okay, how do I reshape my identity in this place, you know? So that, you know, there is a poem that she wrote which is called Nigger, and it's often quoted. There must have been many, many people who had been subject to that sort of racial abuse in the street and found their own way of dealing with it, maybe silencing the pain. But she found a way to turn that commonplace experience, I think, for Black people into art. And she did that, you know, with her play as well, and with a number of poems. So as you quite rightly say, she was doing many, many different things. And I think the fact of her engaging in different sorts of ways was because she was always determined to keep going back and finding what that true self needs to say, to do, what that legacy is going to be. You know, she wasn't somebody who became, she did marry quite late in life, but she wasn't somebody who became a mother. But the legacy is very much to do with this voice, this path, that other people can now look at and analyze and make sense of, I think.
Yes, that idea of authenticity and being true to yourself is exactly the same sensation and feeling I got as I read her poems and her plays and learned more about her life. And I also just found that inspiring because of the age and the times that she was active and what that must have meant to be so resilient. And we really get a flavor of how she must have been, like, and how she might have spoke to people and her persuasions and her charm and just all of everything she must have brought in order to do all that she did and get people on her side and get the support and belief in what she was doing. It's such an incredible testimony to being yourself, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
I also think what you said about the expression through art is so particular for Una Marson, because I read some, it's almost like a side comment. It wasn't a criticism, but it was like a kind of side eye, throwing shade, you know, we might say. Like she was linked in with the suffragette movement at that time. And there was a comment from some of the suffragettes that, you know, in essence, like, oh, well, she's decided to do theatre, you know, almost like, you know, you may think. And but the article was trying to say to the readers, I know there's lots of stuff to do, but, you know, Miss Marson thinks that this is a way to build community and, you know, we should try and get behind her. So from that, I really got a sense of what she might have been up against in respect of trying to express herself creatively,
Absolutely.
which is such a gift, you know, now, because we really know how she was thinking and how she felt, which is just incredible. But she was up against it, wasn't she?
She certainly was up against it. You know, there was somebody I interviewed many, many moons ago now who said, well, you know, she wasn't a very attractive woman, you know. So, you know, we can sideline her. And one of the important poems that she wrote was called Cinema Eyes. you know, now in the context of Black Lives Matter and even the Me Too movement, it seems obvious that one would say to young Black girls, for example, that, you know, you are beautiful as you are. Your role models don't have to be, you know, fair, blue-eyed, you know, women. And there are many, many examples of strong, beautiful Black women, right, from across the globe. But back in the day, you know, back in the 1930s, when she was writing this stuff, you know, and Hollywood's power basically said, you know, this is what you aspire to. You know, this wasn't a time when, okay, Paul Robeson was there and he was doing some films, but, you know, she wasn't surrounded by lots of wonderful Black women, you know, actors, poets, directors, activists, all talking about, you know, Black is beautiful, you know. That's the stuff that we've actually been able to benefit from and then build our movements, you know, 20th century, 21st century movements out of that consciousness that came, you know, from the 60s onwards. And I know, you know, one of the people who was just fantastically supportive of my work, and, you know, like many, many people are missing dearly, is, you know, Stuart Hall. He happened to be taught by Una Marson's sister, so he actually knew the family. And he was also able to talk about, you know, those sort of colour codes that exist, and still do exist in Jamaica, you know, the way that a dark-skinned woman would be considered less than her fairer counterpart. So I think that, you know, Una herself was battling against these things, you know, in her day-to-day life and in relationships and, you know, her sense of self, sexuality and all of that. But then she was able to take them and say, well, okay, it is more than just my own personal pain and dissatisfaction. There's something here to put out into the world. So that move from, you know, the thought actually to the art was very, very well marked and well done, I think.
That's incredible insight. That's so nice to hear and to know that side of things. And she was without question visionary in that regard, because what you're talking about is that reflection of the generational experience. She was able to, like you said, put her pain, she understood where that sat in the chronology, and then see the generational step that she could play a part in. And one of her poems that just I can't stop thinking about is To Wed or Not to Wed. You know, the playing on Hamlet, and she just spoke for me to now of the consideration of any woman considering her career as a valid priority, you know, next to family. And I just found it so sophisticated and gorgeous, and it's just spoke right to my heart. And I found it really reassuring to sort of be like, yeah, well, if Una Marson's talking about that, you know, I'm okay with questions and doubts and reflections, you know. It's the work's really affirming. It's really affirming, and because she was so visionary.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the thing, that of course you put it out there, you know, you create the poem or the play or whatever it is in order to have that dialogue with readers, with potential readers, you know. And clearly that was a poem addressed to women, probably.
Yes, I think so, yeah.
And saying, well, you know, I've had these thoughts, and, you know, giving permission, actually. So yes, in some ways, I see some of that work as a kind of forerunner of some of the conversations we had when I was in Brixton Black Women's Group, or in other women's groups and organisations that, you know, I've been involved with. That we had the opportunity to sit and talk things through. She, I think, largely was, you know, writing on her own in her flat in Camberwell, and but putting it out there, you know, for us, for the future and what have you. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's so cool.
Yeah.
Is there anything from your research that really surprised you?
Apart from the first sort of big surprises of what she'd done and where she'd gone, I think one of the things that still surprises and impresses me, I think, a little, inevitably, because I'm based here. I was most in tune with the British end, if you like, of the story. Although she did end up working in Israel for a while as well before she died. But one thing that I've been thinking about was very impressive was that when she finished her work at the BBC, so at the end of the Second World War, she returned to Jamaica. It's well known that she set up the Pioneer Press, but she was also busy touring the rest of the Caribbean region in order to find out the standard and the expectations, if you like, that people had of broadcasting for the future. So in some ways, she was being a bit of a consultant, right? Also a bit of a consultant. She was consulting people in order to strategize or help the BBC strategize and plan for the future. And I think that's a very interesting, sort of almost behind the scenes type aspect to her career. That she recognized the importance of establishing networks for the Caribbean. There'd been a moment, the Second World War, when inevitably the colonies had been called on in terms of personnel to fight, resources, we know that. So there's a sense of, okay, this is a mother country and we all pull together and do our bit. But when the war was over, she was clearly thinking that, right, we need to make sure that these people are not just then thrown back, if you like, on their own poor resources, but given what they need to be effective, if you like, moving into the late 1940s, early 50s. So again, I think that to me, that's very interesting. It's very different in a sense from the, I have a poem, I have a series of poems, I'm going to do my book, I'm going to do my play, or even the journalism. This is actually about looking at infrastructure. It's about forward planning. And because she had been working at the BBC and doing things like Caribbean Voices, she obviously had a good sense then of the entire region. Whereas, as you know, there's a tendency that people, before they came to London, would know their bit. It's when we come to London, we go, oh, you're Nigerian, oh, you're so, and we come together and we get a different sense, right, of that. So she'd got that, I think, from working at the BBC and meeting all these other people. But then she clearly wanted to, make it, to concretize it, to make it more effective, I think. I think that was, pretty cool.
So fascinating, like thinking about that sense of responsibility that she felt, and perhaps what then was sparked from all the information she gathered and put together, and how that work, I guess, must have just naturally seamlessly become part of the infrastructures and ideas that, we don't even know the full extent of her impact, in fact.
Yeah.
That's really, really awesome. It's great. Thank you so much, Delia. Absolutely loved talking to you.
Thank you very much for asking me.
Okay, well, until next time.
Until next time.
That was London Calling and Beyond. Una Marson, Her Life and Achievements, with Delia Jarrett-Macauley and Ayesha Casely-Hayford.